The position of president was bestowed upon me in recognition for work that I had done for 6 years as the chairman of the local history society. This has been an honour for me because the previous president was the local lord of Rhuddlan Hall, and it also encouraged me because he lived to a good old age of 105, and after serving in a long period of time in the forces. At the start of the First World War, there were 16 pubs in the village, and don't forget that this village was a predominantly Welsh-speaking village. When I was 4 years of age, I couldn't speak English. I could only speak Welsh. And the reason that we lost the language, and we did lose it, simply because during the Second World War, we had evacuees coming from Birmingham, Manchester, and Liverpool. And it really knocked us about because we were not used to people coming in from the cities. There used to be a train service here which ran 4 or 5 times a day. Then there was a livestock auction twice a week. There was an active police force here. There was 4 banks and now there are none. There were 3 butchers and now there's only 1. There were 3 coal merchants working out of the local station, some of them working with horse and cart. Local farms would take their livestock along the main road to the market and also along the main road and from their farms twice a day for milking. They would also take their sheep along the main road from their place of shearing and to a better place for grazing. Now, can you imagine along the M56 a whole load of sheep in front of you and you having to stop while they have preference over the road? Because that's what used to have to happen, right? Now, we used to play football on the main street and stop just to let the odd car or the horse and cart to pass. I used to live in Parliament House and I lived there for 22 years. We moved there in 1938, and when we moved to Parliament House, we didn't have any lights. There was no electricity there. There was no gas there. There was no water in. The toilets were shared between next door and ourselves. And my mother would often say to me and to my brother and sisters when they came along, you make sure you keep the toilets clean because the lady next door also uses that. We used to play football on the main road, in actual fact, and we used to stop when the odd car came along, because don't forget we're talking before the Second World War or around the Second World War, and there wasn't a great deal of cars about. But what you would get is you'd have cart horses and coalmen and people carrying their wares and selling them as they're going along from the cart. Right now, I lived in Parliament House for 22 years. We moved there in 1938. I was born, in actual fact, I was born in St. Asaph, which is a village, which is now, of course, it's classed as a city. It wasn't then. It got the stature of cityness from the last government and the government before that. So it was a cathedral city. And what happened was, Edward I, they were going to build the cathedral here in Rhuddlan. And they applied to the Pope if that would be okay. And he said, well, he didn't say, because he didn't get the message, because unfortunately he died. The Pope died, and therefore what happened was the town decided to leave it where it was. They built the cathedral in St. Asaph, and of course we had the St. Mary's Church, which was built in his time, which was 1301, because he died in 1307. Now, I used to live in Parliament House, and when you think about it, you're thinking 22 years we were there, and you would wonder how people would put up with conditions that we put up with when we moved into the house. Because when we moved into the house, there was no electricity. The water was outside in a yard. So if we needed water in the winter for the morning breakfast, we had to make sure that we filled everything up with all the canisters that we had, because we would need them for the morning. Then we had an old sack which we put round the taps. The toilet was shared between next door and ourselves, and I was the eldest son there and the first to live in there with my parents, and then my brother came along and my two sisters, and my mother always used to say, you must make sure you keep the toilet clean. Now, could you imagine today people getting a house and the landlord saying, now don't forget, you've got to keep the toilet clean because the people next door will be using it. And it was the same, we had to cook on the fire. And it sometimes asks us to recall something that perhaps happened during that period of time. Well, one thing I can relate to very, very simply, my mother used to have to boil the potatoes on the fire. And what would happen is that the fire sometimes would move, the saucepan would move and would tip. And what would happen is all the water from the pan would actually put the fire out. So we're trying to cook maybe a supper or whatever, and they suddenly found out that the water has put the fire out, so we'd have to start all over again. And that's how it was. You know, when you think about it, this was in 1938, and we lived there until 1962. And in all that time that we lived there, we did have electricity installed, but the water was still outside. And I can remember my mother would say to me, when you come home from school, you've got a job for you. And I would say, what job will that be? Well, you come home from school and I can tell you. So you come home from school, and I would say to her, what job did you want me to do? And don't forget, I was only 11 years of age. I was just going to primary school in Rhuddlan. And I would say, what job did you say I've got to do? She said, you've got to get on the roof and repair, there's a hole in the roof and the water's coming in. When it rains, all the water comes down and we've got to get up there. And I can remember, like yesterday, looking over the top of the roof, and the landlord who owned the house looked up as I was looking down, and he said to me, come down from there, you've got no right to be there. And I said, we're trying to repair the roof. Get down, he said, you're not supposed to be up there. And that's what I had to do. So when I used to come home from school, whereas a lot of children would go and play with all sorts of things, I had to learn how to repair a hole in a roof. And you would maybe get the cement. I'd have to go and get the cement from a builder. I'd have to mix it. I'd have to take it up on the roof. I'd have to put the slate on it. And then if it rained during the night, all the cement would wash away. So the backyard would be covered in a cement form of water. So that's exactly how it was then. But I'm not complaining about that. But I'm saying that's how it was for everybody. With the history, it's what's gone before you. If you think today what you did yesterday, that is actually history. That's all that you can remember. So it's important that people remember what went on. Because don't forget, 2 world wars here. It was only a village. And we lost 22 men in the First War. And we lost 12 men in the Second World War. And you might think, well, that's not a very great number of men to lose in a war. But it was when you think that it was a village. This was a village, predominantly Welsh village. Everybody you saw spoke Welsh to you. And if they didn't, they would soon learn how to do it. Because even then, when you went to school, they used to try and get you to speak English. Now, perhaps some of the children of Rhuddlan have lost grandparents in the war. And that's one of the reasons why it's important to teach them that. Because, you see, you often hear people say, my grandfather never talked about the war. And my answer to that is very, very simple. Perhaps nobody asked him. Or if you actually said to me, can you talk about Rhyl and its history? And I would say, well, if you want me to talk about Rhyl and its history, it will be only 350 years going back, because that's all there was, because it was sand dunes, and that's what it was. Now then, if you said to me, could you talk about Rhuddlan? I can go back 9,000 years, and we're only 2.5 miles away. And that's what we could do here. We got, you may often hear me when I pronounce Rhuddlan as Rhuddlan, and it means the red banks. And that relates to the Saxon hammering that they gave us in 987, I think it was, where they hammered us, and they must have been on the banks of the river was all red. So basically, that's why it's important to remember your history and teach it to everybody, because everybody has history. So don't go listen to what they tell you. That people say, I don't know what to say. No, you do know what to say. Just have a little think. And that's basically what you have to do with history. And we used to also go to the castle. The castle was a place where it attracted people, attracted kids, because it's climbing. All kids climb. And it was Edward I who built it. Now you are now sitting in the centre of a room which had a altar knocked together every Saturday night, so that the Catholics could go on Sunday and do their worshipping. And then when Sunday came, finished, everybody stayed behind, cleared up the altar, cleared up everything else, and it was just like another room again until the weekend. Then it would start all over again. Rhuddlan Castle were built, in actual fact, they were built to keep the Welsh in. That's why they were there. What they did here was he built the castles. Right, he went from Rhuddlan, he went to Flint, Beaumaris, Conway, Carnarvon, so that if there was any problems in a particular castle, there was an uprising, they would only have to travel for one day, so that A could get to B, B could get to C. And that's how they did it. And they called it the Ring of Iron. Well, Lord Langford lives in a very large house. It's a big hall, and it's between here and Disseth. And he used to have the salmon rights to anybody that fished. I make a joke about the fact is that the river bridge, when we spoke about the film on the buses, that particular bridge, one side of that bridge, you can't fish without a special permit from Lord Langford's estate. The other side of the bridge, you could fish. And I always used to say because there's nothing worse than keeping everything too serious, because I think that humour is a fantastic tool to somebody who speaks, because they can twist things like nobody's business. And I always used to say that when the fish came down from Lord Langford's, they would get as far as the bridge and turn round and go back, because the guys in Rhuddlan never got a chance to catch the salmon, because they didn't come through the bridge because it was just eels going out to sea. That's what they used to get.